It wasn't just a crucifixion. It was a verdict orchestrated in the dark. A trial rushed through midnight shadows. A prisoner arrested in an olive grove by torchlight. Judges who already knew the sentence. Witnesses who couldn't keep their stories straight. And behind it all, politics, prophecy, and panic. Because the question wasn't whether Jesus was guilty. The real question was guilty of what power trembled when he spoke. Empires shifted when he walked. And when they nailed him to a Roman cross, it wasn't justice that won. It was fear. So let's slow down now. The drama of that night has echoed for centuries, but the truth, it moves quietly hidden in overlooked details and dusty records. The pace here won't rush. We'll walk gently, step by step, through the shadows they left behind. Imagine Jerusalem not in sunlight, but under moonlight. The year is somewhere between 30 and 33 CE, and the city is stretched tight like a drawn bowstring. Roman troops patrol the outer courts of the temple. Jewish pilgrims fill the streets carrying lambs and prayers. And somewhere in this thrumming, overheated, overcrowded city, a man named Jesus is being watched. He speaks like a prophet, moves like a revolutionary, and teaches like someone who isn't afraid to rewrite the rules. To the crowds, he's a healer. To the priests, he's a hazard. To Rome, he's becoming a problem. And now he's been arrested. But not by the Romans, not yet. First, he's taken to a secret council. The high priests, the elders, men whose fine robes conceal sleepless eyes and nervous hands. They aren't seeking truth. They're managing a crisis. This is the beginning of the most infamous trial in human history. A trial without a jury, without a defense, without even daylight. Over the next few hours, Jesus will be dragged through courts, interrogated by powerful men, passed like a hot stone from hand to hand. Evidence will vanish. Testimonies will contradict. And somehow the punishment will be decided before the charge is even clear. So was it really blasphemy that condemned him, or sedition, or something even more dangerous, like an idea that refused to die? Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. Because what we're about to uncover is not the version told in stained glass or Sunday school. This is the trial behind the crucifixion, and it all begins now. You can feel it in the dust. Not just the desert kind that clings to sandals and skin, but the weight of empire ground into the stones of Jerusalem by 100 Roman boots. At first glance, the city seems like it belongs to the priests. The temple gleams in gold, and marble sacrifices are made daily, and crowds sing psalms in Aramaic. But over all this, like a hidden hand, looms Rome. This isn't the Rome of statues and senators. This is provincial Rome, practical Rome, the Rome that governs through fear and taxes. Pontius Pilate has ruled as governor for nearly a decade by the time Jesus is arrested. And he does so with an iron fist and an ulcer from managing the explosive fusion of Roman pride and Jewish zeal. There's no love between Pilate and the people he rules, just mutual suspicion and the occasional riot. One wrong word, one spark, and Jerusalem could go up like kindling. And Passover. That's always the most dangerous time. For Judea's Jews, Passover is more than a festival, it's a memory of escape, of God freeing them from Egypt, of overthrowing Pharaoh, of liberation. It's a celebration steeped in rebellion, and every year Rome reinforces its presence to smother the mood before it gets too hot. Soldiers flood the city. Pilate leaves his coastal villa in Caesarea to sit closer to the fire, and every priest, zealot, and tax collector can feel the tension crackling. Into this pressure cooker walks Jesus. Not quietly, not invisibly, but riding a donkey like a king fulfilling prophecy. People throw down palm branches and shout Hosanna. It's not subtle. It's also not illegal. But it is unmistakably provocative. Now, by historical record, Pilate wasn't known for leniency. Philo of Alexandria paints him as cruel and quick to violence. But oddly, during Jesus' trial, he seems hesitant, which raises a curious possibility. Was Jesus even Pilate's primary concern, or was Pilate more interested in placating a different threat? Because the real power in Jerusalem wasn't just Roman, it was religious. The Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, held enormous sway. They couldn't execute under Roman law, but they could stir up trouble. They could also calm crowds, collect taxes, and enforce religious order. Rome let them do so for a price. This uneasy alliance between sword and scroll explains much about what followed. Pilate didn't need to believe Jesus was guilty. He only needed to believe that not condemning him would make things worse, especially if the high priests demanded it, especially if letting Jesus go risked rebellion. And here's where the historical curiosity sharpens. Jesus wasn't the only so-called Messiah walking around Judea at the time. In fact, he was part of a larger pattern. First-century Palestine was brimming with would-be prophets and self-proclaimed deliverers. Some carried swords. Some carried scripture. Most ended badly. Roman records and the writings of Josephus mention multiple uprisings, insurrections, and charismatic leaders claiming divine backing. But Jesus was different. He didn't call for armed revolt. He didn't build an army. He flipped tables and quoted Isaiah. A strange threat. Not a military one, but perhaps a more unsettling kind. An idea that Rome couldn't stab or silence. And that's the open question scholars still debate today. Was Jesus arrested because he threatened Roman peace? Or because he exposed the fragility of religious power pretending to be divine? Some historians argue the trial was a political necessity. Others see it as a theological reckoning disguised as law. One curious detail supports the idea of deeper coordination, the timing of the arrest. Jesus is taken not during the chaos of daytime teaching, but at night in a quiet garden away from crowds. That alone suggests a plan, a cooperation between temple authorities and Roman enforcers. Not because Jesus was violent, but because his presence in the city during Passover was dangerous enough, even without a sword. You may recall the uneasy arrival of Jesus we just described, riding through cheering crowds, fulfilling prophecy on the eve of a feast built on liberation. That kind of entrance doesn't just challenge political order, it challenges religious monopoly. And that's a threat both Pilate and the priests could agree to silence. It's also worth noting that Pilate had no particular love for the Sanhedrin. Yet here we see him bending, negotiating, and ultimately caving. That's not fear of one man, it's fear of the consequences of not acting. Fear of an uprising, real or perceived. And that fear, it's still under debate. Some believe Pilate feared Rome more than Judea, that he was already under scrutiny from Caesar for previous missteps. Others argue he feared another Passover riot, and Jesus was just the unlucky symbol. Regardless, the city's political landscape was a chessboard, not a courtroom. Every move had implications. Every gesture was weighed for reaction. And Jesus, he wasn't just a pawn or a king. He was the player whose very presence broke the rules of the game. There's no record of a riot that year, at least, not until after the crucifixion. But the whispers were there. The fear was thick. And in that climate, justice often became collateral damage. So when the trial began, it wasn't held in a vacuum. It unfolded in a city bristling with soldiers, seething with unrest, and holding its breath. They had seen prophets before. wanderers with hollow eyes and hungry followers proclaiming the end of the world or the start of a new one. The temple had weathered dozens of them, some harmless, some dangerous, most forgotten. But Jesus of Nazareth was proving harder to dismiss. He didn't beg for attention. It followed him. And worse, he didn't break the law. He bent it, reframed it, exposed it. And for the high priests, that was more threatening than any sword. Caiaphas, the high priest at the time, wasn't a fool. He was politically savvy, deeply tied to both the Sanhedrin and Rome, and above all, he was a protector of the temple's stability. Not its sanctity, its stability. The temple was not just a holy place. It was an institution, an economy, a power center. And Jesus had stepped into it and flipped tables. Literally. You remember that moment, the whip, the coins, the overturned stalls. It wasn't just protest. It was performance. And it was seen. That act alone might have made him a target. But the deeper issue was theological. Or rather, it appeared to be. Jesus didn't just challenge the mechanics of temple worship, he undermined the authority that kept it sacred. He preached forgiveness without sacrifice, relationship, without priesthood, salvation, without institution. In short, he made the high priests redundant, and no one likes being made obsolete. The Gospels suggest that Caiaphas convened the Sanhedrin to deal with Jesus before the feast. That implies premeditation. This wasn't a panicked response, it was strategy. They needed to remove him without martyring him, silence him without elevating him. And if they could do it under the guise of law and blasphemy, all the better. Now, the charge of blasphemy wasn't used lightly. Jewish law required careful evidence, 2 or more witnesses to the same event agreeing in detail. But Jesus had a habit of saying just enough to raise suspicion without offering sound bites. He referred to himself in veiled terms, the Son of Man, the one who would be seated at the right hand of power. Phrases lifted from Daniel and Psalms, soaked in messianic meaning, but deniable in court. This linguistic dance frustrated the priests. They wanted a clear statement, an admission, something they could write down and wave in front of Pilate. But Jesus didn't cooperate. Even when directly asked, "Are you the Messiah?" he responded with, "You say that I am." Not quite yes, not quite no. More like a theological shrug. This forced the priests into a dilemma. If they accused him of blasphemy without evidence, they risked losing credibility. If they let him continue, his influence would only grow. And if Rome suspected they couldn't control their own population, the high priests might find themselves replaced, or worse, removed altogether. This led to the strategy of reframing. If blasphemy couldn't be proven under Jewish law, perhaps sedition could be alleged under Roman law. If Jesus was claiming kingship, however spiritually, he could be painted as a threat to Caesar. And that's where the phrase "King of the Jews" begins to show its teeth. Here's where an obscure detail offers intrigue. Some scholars believe the phrase "King of the Jews" was rarely, if ever, used by Jesus himself. It was a label applied by outsiders, Romans, critics, the occasional crowd. If so, then it may have been a rhetorical trap, a way to turn spiritual influence into political crime. Jesus had never raised a rebellion, but neither had he denied the title when it was flung at him. When Pilate asked, "Are you the King of the Jews?" Jesus responded again with maddening ambiguity, "You say that I am." Same phrase, same dodge. A yes that isn't, a no that can't be proven. And that dance drove the Sanhedrin to desperation. They weren't afraid Jesus would overthrow Rome. They were afraid Rome would think he might. That distinction matters. It suggests they weren't defending faith. They were protecting status. The Gospel of John includes a striking moment where Caiaphas declares, "It is better that one man should die for the people." than that the whole nation perish. That line has been interpreted as prophecy politics and pure panic. But in it, you hear the dilemma in full. Jesus wasn't just a theological issue, he was a national risk. One ongoing debate in historical scholarship centers around the actual power the Sanhedrin held at this time. Some argue they had significant local autonomy. Others believe they were little more than symbolic clerics useful for crowd control, but powerless in capital matters. If the latter is true, then Caiaphas may have been playing a very dangerous game, offering Jesus up as a scapegoat to prove his loyalty to Rome. There's also evidence that not everyone in the council agreed. The Gospel accounts mention Joseph of Arimathea as a dissenting voice, wealthy, quiet, and ultimately the man who takes Jesus' body for burial. That suggests cracks in the unity. If the verdict was unanimous, there'd be no need to mention dissent. But it wasn't. And so the trial became not a legal proceeding, but a managed event. A performance for Pilate, for the crowds, for history. The priests played their part. Jesus played his. And the outcome, while not inevitable, was choreographed. You'll remember the mood in Jerusalem from before tents overheated, brimming with pilgrims and soldiers. Now imagine being a priest in that environment, holding on to power by threads, watching as one man commands more attention with a parable than you can with a scroll. That isn't blasphemy. That's threat. And in their minds, silencing that threat wasn't just self-preservation. It was preservation of order, tradition, and control. The temple would fall within a generation, but they didn't know that yet. They only knew the courtyard was filling with voices that weren't theirs. And in the silence between those voices, fear whispered the verdict before the trial ever began. It was always going to come down to language. Not swords, not mobs, not even scrolls. Just words and what those words meant to the wrong ears at the wrong time. When Jesus stood before the religious authorities, what they needed was a charge. Something they could name, point to, and justify. And blasphemy was the sharpest arrow in their legal quiver. But pinning that on him wasn't as easy as it sounded, because blasphemy under Jewish law required a very specific offense, not just claiming something divine, but doing so in a way that directly insulted or diminished the holiness of God. It wasn't about causing offense. It was about theological trespass of the highest order. Jesus never once said the exact phrase, "I am God." Instead, he said things like, "Before Abraham was I am," or "the Father and I are one." Ambiguous, absolutely. But for those trained in Scripture, these were loaded phrases. I am was the divine name revealed to Moses at the burning bush. One with the Father blurred a line monotheism had held firm for centuries. He didn't tear the curtain of the temple, but his words shook its foundations. The high priests latched onto those statements not necessarily because they were definitively blasphemous, but because they were dangerously close. Enough to make their case, if not legally, then rhetorically. But here's the problem: even within the Sanhedrin, not everyone agreed that what Jesus had said was a death-worthy offense. And so the narrative began to shift. Blasphemy alone might not hold water in a Roman court. Rome, after all, didn't prosecute theological disputes between Jewish sects. But if Jesus could be presented as claiming kingship, a rival to Caesar, now that was a threat Rome understood. Here's the curious part: the Gospels describe Jesus being asked if he was the Messiah, and also if he was the King of the Jews. Those aren't synonymous. Messiah is a Jewish concept, a spiritual liberator, a fulfillment of prophecy. King of the Jews, however, is a Roman political category. It suggests rebellion, governance, sedition. So why the switch? One theory is that the Sanhedrin deliberately reframed the charge for Roman ears. What began as a theological trial pivoted into a political one. It wasn't that Jesus claimed to be divine, it was that he claimed to be sovereign. And under Roman law, only Caesar had that right. This creates a fascinating interpretive fork. If Jesus' trial started as a question of blasphemy, but ended as a case of sedition, then we have to ask, was the charge true? Or was it manufactured to satisfy two different audiences? Historical records suggest this pivot wasn't uncommon. Roman governors often acted on vague reports of unrest. They weren't looking for truth, they were looking for peace. And if a troublesome teacher had to be sacrificed to maintain order, so be it. But the question still lingers, was Jesus crucified for what he believed, or for what others said he believed? There's a lesser-known episode from the trial that hints at the tension. When asked directly by the high priest to respond to accusations, Jesus remained silent until pressed. Then he said, "You will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." A poetic phrase, but also a quote from Daniel, a book filled with apocalyptic visions and divine authority. In response, the high priest tore his robes and cried, "Blasphemy!" But that act, tearing robes, was traditionally forbidden for high priests under Levitical law. So either Caiaphas broke the law out of genuine outrage, or the gesture was symbolic theater, an outward sign meant to clinch an inwardly shaky case. Modern scholars remain divided. Some argue that Jesus intentionally walked the line between theology and rebellion, that he spoke in riddles precisely to provoke, while remaining legally unassailable. Others suggest he never intended to challenge Rome at all, that his message was spiritual, and the politics were imposed on him by others with more to lose. Either way, the result was the same. A man who taught peace was executed like a rebel. A man who healed the sick was labeled a threat to the empire. And those who stood to lose power if he continued, both religious and political leaders, made sure his words were reinterpreted as crimes. You may recall from earlier how Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem triggered unease. That same unease pulsed through the council chambers. It wasn't just what he said, it was the effect it had on people. His words had gravity, not because they were inflammatory, but because they stuck. That's what power fears most, not loudness, but resonance. And so the charge was selected not for its truth, but for its utility. Blasphemy got him arrested. Sedition got him crucified. Neither may have been entirely accurate, but both served the same end. As for the crowd, their role remains elusive. Were they truly convinced Jesus was dangerous, or did they simply follow the narrative laid out for them by authority? After all, if your leaders tell you a man is a blasphemer, and your rulers tell you he's a rebel, and you're standing in a square surrounded by soldiers, how loudly would you protest? That's the haunting question left behind by the trial. Not just what was said, but what was believed. Not just what Jesus claimed, but what others needed him to have claimed. And in that swirl of interpretation and fear, the truth may have been trampled not by malice but by necessity. It began not with a horn blast or a trumpet's cry, but with the quiet shuffle of sandals through dew-soaked grass. Gethsemane was a garden of stillness, tucked away at the foot of the Mount of Olives, a place of olive presses, quiet prayer, and moonlight heavy on the branches. A place Jesus often visited, a routine spot, predictable. And that predictability is exactly what made it the perfect trap. The timing was deliberate. Nightfall wasn't chosen for convenience, it was strategy. In daylight, Jesus moved among crowds. Too many witnesses, too much risk of public outcry. But in the dark, no mobs, no miracle-seeking strangers, just sleeping disciples and silence. The arrest wasn't an act of justice. It was containment. Controlled, rehearsed, and deeply inconvenient for truth. Judas appears first, not with remorse, but with coordination. He's not wandering, he's leading. The Gospels tell us he brought with him a detachment of soldiers and officials from the chief priests and Pharisees. That detail matters. Soldiers and officials. Roman and Jewish cooperation. Two jurisdictions normally tense working together for one midnight mission. And the sign, a kiss. Of all gestures, the most intimate becomes the most incriminating. Judas could have pointed, could have spoken, but instead he kissed the man he betrayed. The Gospels preserve that image like a bruise on history's cheek. Here's where the historical threads tangle. Roman soldiers patrolling at night outside temple grounds was uncommon. So either Judas had authority from the Sanhedrin to bring armed temple guards, or there was deeper coordination with Pilate's troops, suggesting Rome was already in the loop. Some scholars believe Pilate had approved the arrest in advance, or at least allowed it to happen. Others argue the soldiers were only temple guards, not Roman legionnaires. The text is unclear. The motives less so. Jesus doesn't run. He doesn't resist. In fact, he steps forward. "Whom do you seek?" he asks. And when they say his name, he responds, "I am he." Simple words. But the Gospel of John describes something strange. The soldiers fall back, as if struck by a force beyond understanding. It's theatrical, or metaphysical, or metaphorical. Either way, it paints the moment as more than procedural. But then the swords flash, not from the guards, from Peter. He draws a blade and slices off the ear of the high priest's servant. And here Jesus performs his final miracle before the trial. He heals the man who came to arrest him. Not exactly the move of a revolutionary, but it sealed something else, his own path. There would be no escape, no riot, just surrender. The arrest at night raises several legal and ethical red flags, even by first-century standards. Jewish law discouraged legal proceedings or arrests after dark. Night trials were considered suspect, likely to be biased or manipulated. Justice, like olives, required daylight to be pressed clean. And yet, here we are with torches bobbing through olive trees and a bound prisoner being led toward the city gates before sunrise. You may remember the earlier tension, Jerusalem swelling with Passover pilgrims, the city teetering on unrest. Now imagine the Sanhedrin watching from the shadows. They didn't want a trial. They wanted a resolution before morning, before Jesus could be seen as a victim, before he could become a symbol. It's often overlooked that the disciples scattered. Fear overtook them. Those who had walked with Jesus for years vanished into the trees. One, according to the Gospel of Mark, fled naked after his robe was grabbed. A detail so odd, so human, it could only come from someone who was there. The night undressed them all, Jesus of his freedom, the disciples of their courage. And what about Judas? His role remains a riddle wrapped in a tragedy. Was he a villain? A zealot disappointed by a peaceful Messiah? A pawn in a prophecy too large to avoid? Some suggest he was trying to force Jesus into a moment of power to trigger the kingdom by provoking a confrontation. If so, it failed. Miserably. And by morning, Judas was gone, his silver abandoned, his story a scar. The arrest also shows how coordinated the authorities had become. They knew Jesus' habits, knew he prayed there often. This wasn't a manhunt, it was a handoff. A careful, quiet move to extract the threat without lighting a fire. One detail often debated is the number of those who came for him. The Gospel of John uses the word cohort, which in Roman military terms could imply several hundred men. That seems excessive. More likely, it was a figure of speech or a deliberate exaggeration to stress how seriously the authorities took this arrest. Either way, the imbalance was clear. One teacher, one sword, and a crowd with clubs and orders. So why the rush? Why the shadows? Because daylight would bring questions, witnesses, crowds who had just days earlier shouted Hosanna in the streets. Daylight would complicate the narrative, but at night they could control the message. Jesus wasn't a prophet. He was a prisoner. This moment, quiet, precise, and oiled with secrecy, is where the trial truly began. Not in a court, but in a garden. Not with testimony, but with betrayal, and the man at the center, he chose silence over resistance. Not because he was defeated, but because he understood that the trial wasn't about him. It was about power. And what power fears more than rebellion is truth spoken gently. The scent of olive oil still clung to the air when they brought him in. The garden wasn't far from the city's edge, but by the time Jesus reached the house of Caiaphas, the night had grown deep. The city slept most of it anyway. Not the guards, not the priests, not the ones waiting behind heavy doors for the trial to begin. Only this wasn't a trial in the usual sense. Not according to Jewish law, not according to justice. What took place was something else entirely, a nighttime proceeding in secret, with a predetermined outcome and rules bent quietly out of shape to make it all look legal. If it sounds shady, it was. According to Jewish tradition, capital cases weren't supposed to be tried at night. The Mishnah, a compilation of oral Jewish laws finalized later, but believed to reflect earlier practices, makes it clear trials that could lead to execution had to occur in the light of day. Judgment wasn't meant for shadows. Evidence required scrutiny, and death sentences couldn't be passed on the same day as a trial. There had to be space, time, reflection. But with Jesus, that space vanished. They brought him before a gathering of the Sanhedrin, likely not the full council, but a hand-picked group who would deliver the verdict they wanted. The trial unfolded before dawn, possibly in the courtyard of the high priest's residence rather than in the temple, which again violated the traditional location for such proceedings. And the timing suspiciously efficient. Arrested at night, interrogated before sunrise, condemned before the city stirred. It was less a trial, more a choreography. The official charge kept shifting. Blasphemy, threats against the temple, claiming kingship. The accusations weren't just inconsistent, they were conflicting. Witnesses were brought forward, but their testimonies didn't align. Even the Gospels admit this contradiction. The accounts mention that two men testified Jesus claimed he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, but their wording didn't match. Under Jewish law, that invalidated their testimony. And yet, the trial continued. You may remember how the high priest tore his robes after Jesus referenced the Son of Man coming on the clouds. That act was supposed to signify horror at blasphemy, but it also conveniently bypassed the need for consistent witness testimony. With that reaction, Caiaphas moved the trial from evidence to outrage, an emotional ruling dressed in ritual, and Jesus silent through most of it. When he did speak, it was brief, cryptic, almost as if he was guiding the narrative toward its inevitable conclusion. One controversial interpretation suggests that Jesus deliberately pushed the boundaries of the law not to escape, but to expose the very system meant to protect justice. He let the contradictions hang in the air. He didn't correct the lies. He didn't offer defense. His silence was its own testimony. This is where modern scholars diverge sharply. Some argue that the gospel writers exaggerated the illegality of the trial to paint the religious leaders in a darker light. Others believe the violations were real and point to the speed and secrecy of the proceedings as proof. After all, if the Sanhedrin truly believed Jesus had committed blasphemy, why not wait until morning? Why not conduct the trial in public in the temple according to the law? The answer might be fear. Not of Jesus, but of what might happen if word spread before they could act. He had followers. He had sympathy. A morning trial could have drawn a crowd. A crowd could have disrupted the process. The priests didn't need justice. They needed a result. And perhaps most tellingly, the verdict of the Sanhedrin wasn't the end, it was a means. They still needed Rome's approval to execute Jesus. Under Roman occupation, Jewish courts had limited authority. They could try religious cases, administer punishments, even excommunicate. But they couldn't carry out capital sentences, not legally. So this nighttime decision, hasty and cloaked in half-light, wasn't just irregular, it was toothless until Pilate made it real. You'll remember how we questioned the nature of the charge. Was it really blasphemy or a political smokescreen? That same question shadows this moment. Because the Sanhedrin didn't bring Jesus to Pilate with a theological complaint. They came with a political one. Suddenly, he wasn't just claiming to be the Son of God, he was a king. A threat to Caesar. That's not legal continuity. That's legal translation. And it's deeply suspicious. There's a curious historical echo here centuries later. Records of this trial would be cited in debates over law, justice, and the rights of the accused. Was it an example of mob rule masquerading as law, or a case of well-intentioned leaders trying to prevent greater unrest? The historical record doesn't settle the matter. But the inconsistencies are undeniable. Another detail often overlooked is the role of the bystanders, servants' guards, and minor officials lingering in the courtyard. It's in that space where Peter famously denies knowing Jesus 3 times. While the high-stakes decisions happen outside a man wrestles with fear and loyalty. The contrast is jarring. Inside, power maneuvering in whispers. Outside, a follower crumbling under the weight of proximity. Peter's denial may seem peripheral, but it reinforces the emotional terrain of this moment. Jesus is alone, not just legally, but personally. His friends have scattered. His accusers are many. And the law, which was meant to protect the innocent, is now being bent to crush him. And that perhaps is the most enduring illegality of this midnight trial. Not that rules were broken, but that they were dressed up as justice. That those sworn to uphold the law twisted it not for gain, but for control, for safety, for the illusion of stability. In a few hours, Jesus will stand before Pilate. The charge will have changed. The robes will be different. But the verdict will already be in motion. It was set not by law, but by fear. The fear of what happens when power loses its grip, and when a carpenter's son dares to speak like a king. When the night turns to trial, the court demands evidence, or at least the illusion of it. And for the Sanhedrin, that meant producing witnesses, people willing to speak, to accuse, to say something damning enough to stick. But the problem was, truth has a way of slipping through rehearsed stories, and lies, no matter how well-dressed, tend to trip over their own shoes. The gospel accounts agree on one striking point. The testimonies brought against Jesus didn't line up. That's not poetic embellishment, it's a legal disaster. Jewish law, especially in capital cases, demanded at least 2 witnesses agreeing in every detail. If even one account diverged, the charge was invalid. So when the accusers opened their mouths and their stories began to wobble, the trial should have collapsed like a tent with no poles. But it didn't. It kept going. Because truth was no longer the goal, outcome was. Among the various charges floated one in particular, stood out the claim that Jesus said he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. It's a statement the Gospels wrestle with. Some place it in Jesus' own mouth, others imply it was a misunderstanding, or perhaps metaphorical. Regardless, it became a centerpiece of the accusation. But even on that point, the witnesses couldn't get their act together. One said he heard Jesus promise to destroy the temple made with hands. Another claimed he said he would rebuild it without hands. The phrasing doesn't match. The timing is off. And under Jewish law, that should have been enough to disqualify the testimony. But instead of throwing it out, the high priest doubled down. It's here that Jesus, so far silent, is asked directly, "Do you have no answer to what these men are testifying against you?" And still he says nothing. No protest, no clarification, just quiet. You might recall the robe-ripping moment from earlier, the high priest tearing his garment, after Jesus invokes Daniel's apocalyptic vision. But that emotional gesture conveniently bypasses the glaring holes in the prosecution's case. False witnesses were technically punishable by the same fate they hoped to bring upon the accused. But not a single accuser is punished here. Instead, their contradictions are ignored, papered over by outrage and urgency. This leads to a fascinating scholarly divide. Some historians suggest the inconsistencies in the witness testimonies weren't just errors, they were signs of a rush job. The Sanhedrin, eager to finalize a verdict before dawn, may have scraped together whatever accusations they could find and hoped the dramatic gestures of the high priest would drown out the inconsistencies. Others propose that the gospel writers emphasize these contradictions to highlight the injustice of the trial, to paint Jesus as the innocent lamb led silently to slaughter. But either way, the contradictions are there, preserved in sacred text. A legal proceeding held together by thread and thunder. There's another detail here that's worth revisiting: the location. You'll remember that the trial likely took place in the house of Caiaphas, not in the temple court, where such proceedings were meant to occur. Combine that with the inconsistent testimony, the nighttime timing, and the fact that the sentence was passed so swiftly, and what you have isn't a trial. It's a theater. Jesus' silence is particularly haunting. He doesn't defend himself, doesn't call for witnesses, doesn't correct the record. That passivity has long been interpreted by theologians as a fulfillment of prophecy, Isaiah's suffering servant silent before his shearers. But viewed through a legal lens, it also makes him uncategorizable. Hard to condemn without making something up, and so they did. The use of false witnesses in ancient trials wasn't rare. But what's remarkable here is how brazen the inconsistencies are, and how little they seem to matter. It paints a picture not of a court seeking truth, but of a council trying to manage a narrative. Jesus had become too big to ignore, too elusive to trap, and too influential to release. His words bent the world, so they distorted them back. This tactic, manipulating public record to serve political need, echoes through history. But here it's especially stark. The charge isn't just incorrect. It's unprovable. It's as much metaphor as malice. Did Jesus say he would destroy the temple? Maybe. But context matters. And context was in short supply that night. You'll recall earlier the anxiety in Jerusalem, the sense that one wrong move could ignite a riot. That anxiety bled into the courtroom. The priests weren't just protecting doctrine. They were protecting stability. And to them, that meant removing the man who made people think too hard about power, about purity, about proximity to God without permission. What's fascinating is that these contradictions weren't later erased from Scripture. The Gospel writers didn't clean them up. They left them in raw, unresolved, and glaring, as if to say, we know this was a mess. We know this wasn't fair. And perhaps that is its own form of testimony. The trial continues. The charge has been declared. The sentence is moving toward Pilate. But in the middle of it all, Jesus stands unblinking, unbroken, and unmoved by the lies swirling around him. And maybe that's what frightened them most. The temple wasn't just a building. It was the heart of Jerusalem, the pulse of Jewish identity, the intersection of heaven and earth carved in stone. Its walls weren't merely physical, they were psychological. The temple governed the rhythm of life, the meaning of sacrifice, the calendar of the sacred. And so when someone so much as hinted at its destruction, even metaphorically, alarms rang louder than any trumpet at dawn. That's why the accusation that Jesus threatened the temple was so potent. Even more than claiming kingship, it targeted the very soul of the religious order. To say the temple would fall was to suggest that God's presence would withdraw, that sacrifice was obsolete, that something new was rising in its place. Now Jesus had said things, not just things, but things that lingered. In John's Gospel, early in his ministry, Jesus famously declares, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." His listeners, understandably puzzled, respond, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you are going to raise it in 3 days." But John immediately clarifies Jesus was speaking of the temple of his body. A metaphor, a riddle, or a threat, depending on who you were. The problem is, metaphors don't fare well in courts. They're slippery. And for those looking to remove a political or theological nuisance, metaphors are easy to weaponize. You may remember from earlier how the witnesses couldn't agree on what exactly Jesus had said. One claimed he said he would destroy the temple made with hands. Another said he would rebuild it without hands. Those weren't minor discrepancies. In Jewish law, such contradictions should have voided the testimony altogether. But the accusation persisted. It persisted because it was useful. Threatening the temple, whether literally or figuratively, was a serious charge. It conjured memories of past desecrations, like the Babylonian destruction centuries before, and fears of future disasters. The temple was both sacred space and national symbol. To threaten it was to threaten everything. This fear wasn't just religious, it was political. The temple was also a Roman concern. It stood at the center of Jewish cohesion. If it fell, riots could erupt. Revolt could follow. Rome might crush the city in response. So anyone talking about its destruction, even in spiritual code, became a lightning rod. One obscure but important fact adds weight here: the temple Jesus would have seen wasn't the original. It was Herod's remodel, a grandiose expansion built partly to curry favor with his subjects, partly to show off imperial architecture. And though the priests operated within its walls, there was tension. Herod's temple was magnificent, but also compromised, a hybrid, a symbol of uneasy alliance between Jewish identity and Roman occupation. In that light, Jesus' statements carry sharper edges. This temple will be destroyed isn't just about bricks. It's about the system they uphold, the sacrifices, the priesthood, the entire machinery of mediated holiness, and his suggestion that something not made by hands would rise in its place. That wasn't just mystical, it was radical. Modern scholars still debate what Jesus meant. Was he predicting his death and resurrection as later Christians believed? Was he critiquing temple corruption, as many prophets had before him? Or was he issuing a coded manifesto for a new kind of faith, one not rooted in place but in person? And yet the ambiguity of his words is what allowed them to be used against him. The temple threat provided the Sanhedrin with something they desperately needed: a bridge between theology and treason. You'll recall how earlier charges of blasphemy struggled to hold weight before Roman authorities. But temple desecration, that was a civil concern. It could stir unrest. Pilate would have to listen. Ironically, by the time the Gospels were written, the temple had been destroyed, flattened by Roman legions in 70 CE during the Jewish revolt. That destruction loomed large in the minds of early Christians, who likely saw in Jesus' words a grim prophecy fulfilled. The metaphor had become reality. Or had reality bent itself to match the metaphor? Here another question rises from the ashes. Did the Gospel writers shape Jesus' words in light of that later destruction? It's an ongoing debate. Some scholars argue the sayings were recorded after the temple fell, retrofitting Jesus as the one who foresaw its doom. Others maintain the sayings are authentic, preserved through oral tradition, and echoed in the charges brought against him. The difficulty is that no one outside the Gospels records this temple threat. It doesn't appear in Roman sources. Josephus doesn't mention it, and yet it sits at the heart of the accusations. Its absence in broader records raises questions. Was it exaggerated? Was it misheard? Or was it so shrouded in metaphor that only later did its meaning become clear? The implications are enormous. If Jesus was seen as attacking the temple system, then the trial was less about legal transgression and more about institutional self-defense. The temple wasn't just sacred, it was threatened, and threatened power strikes back. This connects to something we touched on earlier, the fear not of rebellion, but of replacement. Jesus didn't carry a sword. He didn't storm the gates. He didn't burn scrolls. He simply said things that cracked the foundation of the old order. And sometimes a crack is more terrifying than an earthquake, because cracks spread. And what of those listening in the room that night? Those priests who heard his words about the temple and felt the walls shiver, did they truly believe he meant to bring it down with human hands? Or did they hear beneath the language a new architecture rising, one they could not control? That, perhaps, is the real threat. Not demolition, but transformation. There's a moment, faint, almost casual, when Pilate leans forward and asks, "Are you the king of the Jews?" It's a question soaked in tension, masked as curiosity. Because if the answer is yes, everything changes. The title sounds simple, regal, biblical even. But under Roman occupation, King of the Jews wasn't just a religious title. It was a political grenade. And everyone in the room knew it. To be called Messiah in Jewish tradition was complex. The word means anointed one, conjuring images of David deliverance and divine appointment. But by the 1st century, that term had become volatile. It no longer simply meant spiritual leadership. It implied revolution. A Messiah was expected to overthrow oppressors, restore Israel, maybe even drive Rome into the sea. So when Jesus' followers whispered that he was the Messiah, and his opponents claimed he made himself king, the lines between spiritual leader and political insurrectionist began to blur. Not because Jesus took up arms, but because people feared he might inspire others who would. And Pilate, he was a man whose career depended on preventing that very thing. Now Jesus' own response to Pilate is again maddeningly evasive. "You say so," he says. Neither confession nor denial, just reflection, as if holding up a mirror and letting Pilate hear his own voice. You may recall from earlier how the Sanhedrin had difficulty pinning a charge on Jesus. Blasphemy didn't work in Roman law, but sedition that got attention. So by the time Jesus is brought to Pilate, the accusation has been massaged, transformed. He's not a heretic anymore. He's a rival to Caesar. And that's when the trial takes a turn from theological to imperial. One historical curiosity here lies in the Passover context. During the festival, tensions in Jerusalem were high. Pilate would have been on edge. He was under pressure from Rome to maintain peace, especially after previous missteps, including the brutal suppression of earlier uprisings. Some scholars believe Pilate had already been warned by Emperor Tiberius. One more riot, and his governorship could be over. So now imagine being Pilate. A man is brought before you. He's not armed. He's not rallying troops. But the crowd is stirred. The priests are agitated. And the title king is whispered like a curse. If this man claims kingship, Pilate must act. If he denies it, well, perhaps there's wiggle room. The ambiguity of Jesus' responses put Pilate in a bind. If Jesus had clearly claimed the title of King of the Jews, Pilate could execute him as a rebel. If he had denied it, Pilate could dismiss the case. But Jesus does neither. He occupies a third space, the realm of implication. This raises one of the enduring scholarly debates. Did Jesus ever truly claim to be the Messiah in the political sense? Or was he framed as one because of how others interpreted his words? Some argue that Jesus deliberately avoided the title Messiah during his ministry. Instead, he called himself Son of Man, a phrase with apocalyptic overtones but less political baggage. Others suggest that Jesus embraced the messianic identity, but sought to redefine it not as a military leader, but as a suffering servant. A paradox wrapped in prophecy. And here's where things get even more tangled. The gospel accounts diverge slightly on how the interrogation unfolds. In John, Jesus explains that his kingdom is not of this world. In Luke, the accusers insist he forbade paying taxes to Caesar. That's a bold claim, especially since earlier in his ministry, Jesus had said quite the opposite: give to Caesar what is Caesar's. So either the charges were manufactured or distorted. Either way, the result was that Jesus stood accused of aspiring to kingship, a title that meant death under Roman law. It's important to note that King of the Jews was not a Jewish phrase. Jews of the time might refer to the Messiah or the Son of David, but King of the Jews was a Roman category, a bureaucratic label for a rebel leader. That alone suggests that the trial was being shaped for Roman ears, and yet Pilate hesitates. You may recall from earlier that Pilate was no soft-hearted administrator. He had crucified men for far less. But with Jesus, something was off. The lack of violence, the lack of protest, the crowd's strange fervor seemingly stoked by religious leaders. Pilate smells a setup, and yet the pressure mounts. There's one obscure detail worth noting here. Some early manuscripts refer to Jesus as Jesus Bar Abbas, that is, Jesus, Son of the Father. Barabbas, the prisoner released in Jesus' place, may have shared his name. If so, Pilate was literally asking the crowd to choose between two Jesuses, one accused of violent rebellion, the other of peaceful provocation. A Messiah of blood, or a Messiah of spirit. And they chose the former. The choice itself reveals the political climate. Jesus didn't fail because he was too radical. He failed, if you can call it that, because he wasn't radical enough for the expectations of revolution. And yet he was too dangerous for the status quo to ignore. In this moment, the label King of the Jews becomes something more than accusation. It becomes irony. Because while Rome used it as a reason for execution, and the priests used it as bait for condemnation, Jesus bore it like a crown made of silence. Not accepted, not rejected, simply worn. And in that ambiguity, the verdict begins to write itself. The room must have smelled of sweat and incense, fear and fatigue. The accused stood silent. The priests pressed harder. And in the middle of it all sat Pontius Pilate, governor of Judea, servant of Caesar, and a man caught in a decision that would ripple through millennia. Pilate is one of the most enigmatic figures in the entire Passion narrative. His name is forever stitched to the crucifixion, yet the Gospels portray him with hesitation, even discomfort. Why was this Roman official known elsewhere for cruelty and sharp justice suddenly overcome with conscience? Or was something else at play, To begin, you have to understand who Pilate was. Appointed by Emperor Tiberius, he served as prefect of Judea from roughly 26 to 36 CE. His job wasn't to philosophize. It was to collect taxes, enforce Roman law, and prevent uprisings. Judea, a hotbed of religious zeal and messianic expectation, was one of the more difficult territories to govern. Pilate had no love for the locals, and they returned the favor. Philo of Alexandria and Josephus, two ancient sources outside the Gospels, depict Pilate as inflexible and brutal. He once brought military standards bearing pagan images into Jerusalem, sparking protests. Another time he used temple funds to build an aqueduct and crushed the resulting riot with bloody force. So when we find him hesitating to crucify a man who's been branded a threat to Caesar, it raises eyebrows. Was this the same man? Some suggest the Gospels softened Pilate's image to emphasize Jewish guilt and appease Roman readers. Others argue that in this case, Pilate truly did see no reason for execution and tried to avoid needless unrest. You may remember the earlier trial before the Sanhedrin rushed messy and largely symbolic. By Jewish law, they couldn't carry out capital punishment, especially not during a festival. So they brought Jesus to Pilate. But they changed the charge. No more talk of blasphemy. Now it was treason, claiming to be king, stirring up the people, forbidding tribute to Caesar. It was quite literally a federal offense. Pilate listens. He questions. "Are you the king of the Jews?" he asks. And Jesus, ever elliptical, replies, "You say so." Not helpful. Not incriminating. A phrase that deflects responsibility. And suddenly Pilate's job becomes much harder. One obscure but telling element is that Pilate sends Jesus to Herod Antipas, ruler of Galilee. It's a jurisdictional dodge. Pilate hopes Herod, who happened to be in Jerusalem for the festival, might handle the matter. But Herod returns Jesus, having mocked him and found no guilt. Now Pilate is back where he started. Only now the crowd outside is growing louder. What's fascinating is that Pilate tries multiple times to release Jesus. He offers a Passover pardon, a tradition possibly real or possibly apocryphal, where one prisoner was released to appease the crowd. Pilate presents the people with a choice: Jesus or Barabbas, a known insurrectionist. You'll recall from earlier that Barabbas may have been seen as a hero to some, a rebel against Rome, a symbol of resistance. Jesus, by contrast, stood for peace, for submission to a higher kingdom, for silence in the face of power. And yet the crowd chose Barabbas. This raises another debate. Who was this crowd? Some scholars argue it wasn't the general public, but a group handpicked or influenced by the religious leaders. It wasn't the same people who cheered for Jesus days earlier. It was a different chorus singing a darker song. Pilate's reluctance becomes clearer with each attempt to shift responsibility. He even brings Jesus out scourged and bloodied, thinking perhaps pity will override fury. "Behold the man," he says. But the priests press harder. "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar." And that right there is the knife. The phrase "friend of Caesar" wasn't just a figure of speech. It was a political designation, an honorific that came with implications. To betray that title was to risk your position or your head. The warning wasn't subtle. If Pilate refused to act, they would report him. It's worth remembering that Pilate had already gotten in trouble with Rome for his earlier missteps. One more accusation of leniency toward sedition, and his career could be over. Maybe worse. So when Pilate finally caves, it's not a verdict. It's a calculation. He washes his hands literally in front of the crowd. An old Jewish gesture of innocence, a symbolic move heavy with theatrical finality. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he says. "See to it yourselves." But the thing about washing your hands, it doesn't actually clean them. Some historians argue this moment was pure optics. Pilate wasn't innocent. He was the governor. He gave the order. The plaque on the cross would bear his authority. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And that sign, it's another contradiction. The priests beg him to change it. To write instead, he said he was King of the Jews. But Pilate replies, "What I have written, I have written." A cryptic act of defiance or irony, or perhaps the only truth anyone dared to write down that day. You'll recall earlier how Jesus never clearly claimed the title of king, and yet the system demanded someone wear that crown of thorns if necessary. Pilate became the man who made it so. Not because he believed, not because he judged, but because the pressure outweighed the risk of protest. He wasn't moved by justice. He was moved by survival, and in doing so he became the reluctant judge of the most famous execution in history. You can almost hear the sandals on stone, the shuffle of movement from palace to palace, as Jesus is handed off like a problem no one wants to own. The Sanhedrin wanted him gone but couldn't kill him. Pilate wanted peace but couldn't ignore the priests. And tangled in the middle was a question that still haunts legal scholars today, who had the right to judge and execute this man. Jurisdiction wasn't just a bureaucratic headache in first-century Judea. It was a knife-edge issue finely balanced between Roman law and Jewish autonomy. The Sanhedrin, the supreme Jewish council, handled religious disputes and community law. But when it came to capital punishment, Rome had the final word. That limitation wasn't theoretical, it was historical. Decades before Rome had stripped the Sanhedrin of the power to carry out executions, Jewish leaders could try a man, declare him guilty, even beat or imprison him. But if the sentence was death, they had to ask Rome for permission. The sword belonged to Caesar. Yet here's the curious wrinkle: there's evidence the Sanhedrin did sometimes execute people without Roman approval, especially in cases of mob justice or religious urgency. The stoning of Stephen recorded in the Book of Acts is one example. So why didn't they just deal with Jesus themselves? Some say they feared public backlash. Others argue they wanted Rome's stamp on the verdict to avoid blame. But perhaps most convincingly, they knew that crucifixion would send a stronger message than stoning ever could. Crucifixion was Rome's signature punishment. It was public. It was prolonged. It was humiliating, and it said to the world, this is what happens to those who defy the empire. So they brought Jesus to Pilate. Not for fair trial, but for legal execution. They weren't looking for arbitration. They were looking for authorization. You may recall how earlier accusations shifted from blasphemy to sedition. This wasn't accidental. Blasphemy was a religious offense. Sedition was imperial. And Rome didn't care if someone claimed to be the Son of God, but claimed to be a king. Now that was Caesar's business. And yet even here Pilate hesitates. He interrogates. He delays. He sends Jesus to Herod Antipas, ruler of Galilee, where Jesus had spent most of his ministry. Herod had jurisdiction over that region. Pilate, hoping to pass the responsibility, takes advantage. This Herod, son of Herod the Great, who once tried to kill the infant Jesus, is a curious figure. He's more interested in spectacle than justice. He wants Jesus to perform a miracle like a magician on trial. When Jesus refuses to speak, Herod mocks him and sends him back. It's a legal boomerang. This bouncing of jurisdiction isn't just stalling. It reflects a deeper confusion. No one seems to know what to do with Jesus. He doesn't fit into their legal categories. Not quite rebel. Not quite prophet. Too silent to be dangerous. Too influential to be ignored. Modern scholars still debate whether this jurisdictional back and forth actually happened. Some argue it was a narrative device to show how everyone passed the blame. Others believe it reflects genuine historical tensions between overlapping authorities in Judea. And this leads to an obscure but important point: the Romans didn't always respect Jewish legal outcomes. In fact, they sometimes undermined them openly. So the Sanhedrin's desire to get Pilate's approval wasn't just procedural, it was protective. They wanted Roman endorsement of their decision. If Jesus died under Roman law, the priests could wash their hands too. Which of course brings us back to Pilate's famous gesture. You'll remember how he literally washed his hands, declaring himself innocent of Jesus' blood. But if the verdict was truly out of his hands, why the performance? Why the water? Because legally, the responsibility was his, and he knew it. Roman law allowed for discretionary judgment. Pilate could have pardoned Jesus. He could have dismissed the case. He could have delayed. Instead, he asked the crowd, "Let them decide." And in doing so, he tried to spread the blame so thin that no one could hold it. But jurisdiction is a strange thing. It's not just about law, it's about control. And in this case, everyone had just enough control to be complicit and just little enough to feel justified. The Sanhedrin condemned. Pilate permitted. The crowd cried out. And the result was death. One open question still troubles historians. If the Sanhedrin did have authority to execute, would they have crucified Jesus themselves? Or was their desire for Roman involvement not about law, but about optics? Because a Roman crucifixion said something different. It said this man wasn't just a heretic. He was a traitor, an enemy of the state. His death became a political billboard. And in that way, jurisdiction wasn't merely a matter of geography or legal boundaries. It was the tool by which everyone involved tried to offload the burden of guilt while still achieving the outcome they all desired. Jesus wasn't just tried. He was triangulated. Herod Antipas sat in his temporary Jerusalem residence, likely draped in silks and half bored, when they brought Jesus before him. This wasn't part of the usual festival routine. But then again, neither was a Galilean preacher standing trial for claiming to be a king. And so, for a few moments, the ruler of Galilee had the chance to judge the most talked-about man in Judea. This detour to Herod's court wasn't random. You'll recall from earlier how Pilate, reluctant to condemn Jesus, discovered he was a Galilean by jurisdiction. And Galilee was Herod's domain. It was the perfect political handoff: pass the problem to someone else, someone local, someone with a vested interest in the man who'd stirred up so many rumors near the Sea of Tiberias. Herod Antipas, son of Herod the Great, wasn't exactly a paragon of moral leadership. He's best known in the Gospels as the one who ordered John the Baptist's beheading, an act prompted not by law, but by a party, a dance, and a poorly timed promise. His rule over Galilee was marked by vanity calculation and a knack for staying on Rome's good side. He styled himself as a king, though Rome only called him a tetrarch. So when Jesus entered his chambers bound and silent, Herod was intrigued. Not threatened, not outraged, just curious. Luke's Gospel tells us that Herod had long wanted to see Jesus not for judgment, but for entertainment. He had heard of the miracles, the teachings, the crowds. And now here was the man himself, quiet, bloodied, probably exhausted. Herod expected a show, maybe a sign, maybe a performance. But Jesus gave him nothing. He didn't answer, didn't debate, didn't defend himself. He stood in silence, offering no satisfaction to the man who once silenced John the Baptist with an axe. That silence wasn't empty. It was loaded. A refusal to acknowledge the legitimacy of Herod's authority. A protest without protest. and Herod, with wounded pride and a bruised ego, mocked him. He dressed Jesus in a bright robe, likely a tattered symbol of royalty, and sent him back to Pilate with a smirk. A gesture that said, "He's your problem, not mine." But here's the interesting detail: this moment, petty as it seems, repaired a broken political relationship. The Gospels say Herod and Pilate, who had previously been at odds, became friends that day. The shared handling of Jesus, a problem neither of them quite understood or wanted, brought them together. There's something darkly comic about it, the bonding of two rulers over a man they both refused to truly judge. And yet Herod's non-verdict is telling. He found no fault, no rebellion, no reason for death. He saw a man worn thin, stripped of defense, and said essentially, "Not it." Whether out of cowardice, confusion, or calculated detachment, Herod chose not to act. And in doing so, he pushed Jesus one step closer to execution, not by judging him, but by refusing to stop it. This leads to a broader debate among historians: why include Herod at all? Some argue it was a narrative strategy emphasizing the innocence of Jesus by showing how even a morally dubious ruler found no guilt. Others see it as a subtle nod to prophecy: Jesus, like many biblical figures, being passed from power to power, unjustly tried, yet never condemned by anyone with true authority. And some scholars suggest it reflects the political complexity of first-century Judea, where overlapping jurisdictions and fragile alliances made justice feel more like a board game than a courtroom. There's also a symbolic thread running beneath the surface. Herod represents failed kingship, a man with power but no moral compass, a puppet ruler dressed in robes playing at royalty while Rome pulled the strings. In many ways, he's the antithesis of the Messiah Jesus was claimed to be. You may recall earlier how Jesus was accused of threatening the temple, of claiming kingship, of undermining the old order. Herod stood at the edge of that old order, neither priest nor prophet, neither Roman nor rebel. Just a man in a robe mocking another man in a brighter one. And it's Herod's robe that stays in the story. When Jesus returns to Pilate, he wears that ridiculous garment. It becomes a visual joke and a bitter irony, this so-called king wrapped in fake royalty offered back to the empire with a wink. But it also foreshadows the sign that will be nailed above his head: Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Mockery layered on mockery, truth buried in satire. Herod's involvement, brief as it is, serves to underline how little anyone wanted to take responsibility. The priests wanted Rome to kill Jesus. Pilate wanted Herod to judge him. Herod wanted Jesus to perform a trick. No one sought truth. They sought convenience. They sought escape. And in the silence between those escapes, a sentence was forming. The crowd was already gathered when Pilate stepped forward. The sun was rising, dust caught in the morning light. Somewhere in the distance, lambs were being slaughtered for Passover, and in front of the praetorium, two names hung in the air: Barabbas and Jesus. Pilate had a custom, or so the Gospels tell us. Each year at the feast, he would release one prisoner, anyone the crowd chose. A symbolic act of goodwill, a concession to the people. Whether this tradition truly existed or was shaped later for narrative symmetry is debated, but for this moment, it doesn't matter. Because Pilate saw an opportunity. If the crowd could choose, he wouldn't have to. So he brings out Barabbas, a known rebel, possibly a murderer, definitely a threat to Roman order. And then he brings out Jesus, bloodied from scourging, still silent, still crowned with thorns. A king in mockery, not majesty. A teacher whose crime was unclear. To Pilate, the choice is obvious. Surely they will pick the peaceful one. But they don't. They choose Barabbas. Why, some say it was because the crowd was manipulated. You may recall earlier how the chief priests and elders stirred up support for Jesus' execution, whispering through the crowd like wind through dry leaves. These weren't necessarily the same people who cheered for Jesus during his triumphal entry. These were city dwellers, temple regulars, perhaps even paid agitators. And in a tense-occupied Jerusalem, voices of dissent could be quickly drowned out by voices of fear or persuasion. Others argue the people genuinely preferred Barabbas. He was a rebel, a fighter, someone who'd taken real action against Rome. In contrast, Jesus spoke of turning the other cheek of loving enemies of kingdoms not of this world. Perhaps he didn't meet their expectations. Perhaps they were disappointed. But there's a deeper, more chilling layer. In some ancient manuscripts, Barabbas is given a fuller name, Jesus Barabbas, which means Jesus, Son of the Father. And suddenly Pilate's question becomes haunting. Which Jesus do you want me to release, the Son of the Father, or the one called Messiah? Two saviors, two visions, one violent, one vulnerable. Theologically, the irony is staggering. The crowd chooses the man who fights with weapons, not words. They choose the familiar over the mysterious, the tangible over the transcendent. And in doing so, they unwittingly send the other Jesus, the one who preached peace, healed strangers, and forgave enemies, to a cross. This moment has long been used, sometimes irresponsibly, to place blame on the Jewish people as a whole. But that's a historical distortion. The crowd was specific. The priests were specific. The people of Judea were as divided and complex as any society under occupation. And the real machinery behind the verdict was Roman. Still, the image endures. Pilate standing before the crowd, asking who should live, who should die. And the name that comes back, not the healer, not the teacher, but Barabbas. It raises an enduring question. How often do we choose the wrong savior? How often do we prefer the rebel over the redeemer, the fighter over the forgiver, the noise over the silence? Pilate is stunned. Then what shall I do with Jesus, he asks. And the crowd's response isn't measured. It's unanimous. Crucify him. You'll remember from earlier how Pilate tried to avoid responsibility. Now he's watching it spiral. The choice he offered has backfired, and yet he doesn't stop it. He lets it roll forward, carried by momentum and fear, and Barabbas, he disappears. He's never heard from again. Released into history, unnamed and unresolved. A man who was guilty set free because someone else bore the sentence. And that, of course, becomes the cornerstone of Christian theology. The innocent dying in place of the guilty. A substitution, a cosmic exchange. But in the moment itself, it's simply politics, expedience. Pilate has offered the people a choice, and they've chosen chaos over calm. And so Jesus is led away while Barabbas walks free into a city that has decided, for better or worse, what kind of king it wants. It arrived not in a courtroom, but in a whisper, soft, personal, and deeply inconvenient. While legal arguments swirled around Jesus, while the crowd roared, and the priests schemed, a private message reached Pilate from the most unlikely of sources, his wife. Matthew's Gospel alone preserves this detail tucked inside the chaos of the trial. As Pilate deliberated, a servant interrupted him with a message, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered many things in a dream because of him." And just like that, the trial gained a new, strange dimension, a prophetic dream delivered secondhand at the edge of empire and faith. We know almost nothing about Pilate's wife. The Gospels don't name her. Later tradition gives her the name Claudia Procula, and some strands of early Christian legend even declare her a secret convert. The Eastern Orthodox Church would eventually canonize her as a saint. But in the moment captured in Matthew, she is simply his wife, a Roman woman, dreaming of a Galilean man pleading for his life. Her message isn't legal, it's emotional, spiritual. It doesn't argue the facts. It speaks of suffering her own and of Jesus' innocence. She calls him righteous. That word carries weight in both Hebrew and Greco-Roman thought. It implies not just moral correctness, but divine favor. Now, dreams carried serious implications in the ancient world. To modern ears, a dream might be dismissed as a coincidence or subconscious worry. But to Romans especially, those steeped in classical traditions, dreams were omens. Messages from the gods, warnings, guidance. Entire decisions, even wars, had been shaped by dreams. Pilate would have known this, and so the timing was terrible. You'll recall how earlier he tried to pass responsibility to Herod, how he offered to release Jesus and was stunned when the crowd chose Barabbas. Now, on top of political chaos and public unrest, he's handed a mystical warning from his own household. A plea to walk away. One obscure point worth noting: the dream is not described. We don't know what she saw, whether it was Jesus teaching bleeding dying or simply radiating something beyond comprehension. The vagueness opens the door for interpretation. Was it a dream planted by the divine? Or was it fear, anxiety born from hearing rumors of a holy man on trial for his life? Scholars remain divided. Some see this moment as literary, a narrative device meant to increase Pilate's sense of internal conflict. Others treat it as a genuine historical fragment, a preserved thread of human drama inside the machinery of empire. But no matter the origin, the message would have unsettled a Roman official already standing on the edge of a political cliff. Pilate had already clashed with the people of Judea. His record was bloodied, his relationship with the priests tense. Now his own wife urges him to step back, to refuse the role history had scripted for him. And yet he doesn't. He hesitates, certainly. He tries again to reason with the crowd. But the moment passes, the dream fades, and when the choice arrives, he picks the path of least resistance. It's here that the tragedy deepens. The trial becomes not just a failure of justice, but a failure of intuition. A man warned by both law and wife still chooses convenience over conscience. You may remember from earlier how Pilate washed his hands in an attempt to sever responsibility. But dreams like conscience don't wash off so easily, especially ones shared by someone who sleeps beside you. There's something hauntingly domestic about it. In the middle of political theater, in the heart of an empire's legal ritual, we glimpse a private moment, a wife's nightmare, a husband's unease. And between them, a man who says almost nothing, but carries the weight of prophecy. The dream goes unheeded. Jesus is handed over. But the moment lingers like perfume after someone has left the room. A final warning, a chance to stop the wheel before it crushed another soul. And Pilate, the career politician, the governor of Judea, the reluctant judge, chose silence over disruption. Chose empire over dream. The bowl was likely ceramic, filled with water barely chilled by the morning air. Pilate stood before the crowd, eyes tired, patience thinner than the gold thread on his tunic. The accusations had been shouted. The prisoner had been scourged. The verdict, in truth, had already been surrendered. But Pilate wasn't quite ready to own it, so he reached for the basin. Water poured over his hands. A pause. And then the words, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." The gesture was theatrical. It wasn't part of Roman legal procedure. There was no law, no clause, no statute that required or even suggested that a governor could absolve himself of guilt with a public hand-washing. And that's what makes it so compelling. It wasn't law. It was theater. Theater with ancient roots. In Jewish tradition, hand-washing held profound symbolic weight. The Torah described how elders would wash their hands over a heifer to declare their innocence in the event of an unsolved murder. The act proclaimed, "We didn't cause this, we don't bear the blood." Pilate's gesture echoes that ritual. But as a Roman, he likely wasn't honoring Jewish law. He was leveraging its familiarity for dramatic effect. You may recall from earlier how Pilate was boxed in between an angry priesthood, a stirred-up crowd, and the political risk of appearing soft on sedition. His wife had sent a warning dream. Herod had refused to take responsibility. The crowd had chosen Barabbas. And Pilate, pressed against the edge of control, turned to this symbolic washing, not to cleanse guilt, but to signal distance. But does the gesture work on paper? No. Pilate remained the one with the legal power. The soldiers who would carry out the execution reported to him. The cross would bear his language. The responsibility, however much he wanted to outsource it, remained his. And that's the central irony of the scene. A man with ultimate authority tries to act like a bystander. Some scholars interpret this moment as the turning point, where Pilate shifts from reluctant judge to resigned accomplice. He doesn't believe Jesus is guilty. The Gospels stress this repeatedly. And yet he allows the crucifixion. Why? Because the cost of resisting politically, socially, maybe personally, outweighed the price of compromise. The phrase, "I am innocent of this man's blood," would ring hollow to many in the crowd. And yet it remains one of the most quoted lines from the Passion story. Because in it, we hear something chillingly familiar, the language of justified inaction. Pilate doesn't shout for mercy. He doesn't overturn the judgment. He simply backs away with clean hands and a dirty conscience. One obscure but intriguing literary parallel appears in the writings of Seneca, a Roman Stoic philosopher. He once described leaders who claim moral purity while allowing immoral outcomes as those who kill with clean hands. Whether Pilate read Seneca is unknown, but the idea reverberates. You'll remember earlier how Pilate offered the crowd a choice, Barabbas or Jesus. When that choice went sideways, he didn't try again. He didn't override the decision. He washed, he spoke, and he left. There's another layer worth exploring: the physicality of it. Pilate had Jesus whipped before presenting him. His back was torn. Blood already flowed. So when the governor says, "I am innocent of this man's blood," it is not hypothetical. The blood was present, visible, staining the ground, splattered on robes. The contrast between washing and bleeding could not be more stark. Which raises a difficult question: was this act a symbol of surrender or a calculated PR move? Some modern historians view it as the latter, a performance meant to placate the crowd while protecting his reputation. Pilate was no fool. He knew this moment could come back to haunt him. By publicly stepping aside, he could later claim they demanded it. "I tried to stop it, but the crowd doesn't let him off that easily. They respond, 'His blood be on us and on our children.'" A chilling line debated and misused for centuries. It has been tragically weaponized to justify anti-Semitism, a misuse entirely disconnected from the original context. What the crowd likely meant was a collective acceptance of consequence, a dangerous willingness to claim ownership of what was about to happen. And still, Jesus says nothing. That silence, as we've seen before, refracts everything. The most talked about man in Jerusalem, the subject of prophecy and panic, remains unmoved. While governors gesture, priests rage, and mobs shout, he stands in stillness, as if letting everyone else reveal their nature. You may recall how earlier during his arrest, Jesus healed the ear of a servant wounded in the scuffle. That act of quiet compassion, now echoes against the backdrop of legal gestures and political fear. The man who refused to draw a sword is now sentenced by a man who refused to take a stand. And what of the basin? Did someone dry Pilate's hands? Did he wipe them on a towel? Did the water splash onto the stones and mingle with the blood at his feet? We'll never know. The gospel moves on. The sentence is passed. The cross awaits. But the image of the water lingers, because it reminds us that guilt isn't washed away with a gesture, and silence, no matter how ceremonial, can still echo louder than a shout. The voice didn't rise all at once. It started as murmurs, uncertain and jostling like wind moving through dry reeds. Then came shouts, scattered sharp. And finally, a roar. One word over and over: crucify him. It wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was a storm. Pilate had offered a choice, and the crowd, whether manipulated, mobilized, or genuinely moved, made it. But what followed was more than a verdict. It was a demand for blood, and with it came a question that has never quite faded. Who were they? The Gospels say the crowd, but don't name names. This ambiguity has led to centuries of speculation and sometimes devastating misinterpretation. Blame was cast broadly, sometimes dangerously, on the Jewish people as a whole, an injustice that scholars and theologians now openly reject. The truth is almost certainly more precise. You may remember earlier how the chief priests orchestrated much of the trial's momentum. They had power, yes, but not numbers. So how did a handful of leaders spark a public outcry? It begins with timing. The trial and sentencing happened early in the morning before most people were stirring. Those gathered at the Praetorium were likely not pilgrims who had hailed Jesus days earlier as he rode into Jerusalem. They were residents, locals, perhaps temple employees, traders, or people aligned with the priestly class. A ready crowd, small but loud. And in such settings, a few raised voices can quickly become a flood. It's also worth considering the setting. This wasn't inside the temple courts. This was Pilate's staging ground, a Roman-controlled area with soldiers nearby, pressure high, and authority stacked behind the governor. A dangerous place to speak counter to the current. So when Pilate asked, "What shall I do then with Jesus who is called the Messiah?" and the crowd shouted back, "Crucify him," was it consensus or coercion? Historians debate this fiercely. Some argue the crowd genuinely believed Jesus was a fraud, a false Messiah who had disappointed expectations. Others suggest manipulation, that the religious elite, fearing Jesus' influence, stirred the crowd through fear and suggestion. And there's another possibility, perhaps the people didn't understand the stakes. Crucifixion was a Roman punishment, brutal and shameful, but the full horror of it wouldn't have been grasped from a distance. To some, it may have seemed like a clean removal of a problem. To others, a demonstration of loyalty to the temple or the empire. Still, the force of their demand is undeniable. Crucify him was not a religious cry. It was political. It was about eliminating a threat, restoring balance, asserting control. Pilate, you'll recall, tried to deflect responsibility. He asked, "Why, what crime has he committed?" But by then, the crowd wasn't answering questions. They were giving commands. The legal proceedings had collapsed into theater, and the script had already been written. This kind of mob dynamic isn't unique to the Passion story. Throughout history, collective outrage has led to injustices that no single individual would have dared commit alone. The trial of Jesus captures that terrifying momentum, how fear and manipulation can shape public outcry, how rationality can dissolve in the noise. An obscure detail adds chilling texture. In one account, the crowd responds to Pilate's hand-washing, "With his blood be on us and on our children." It's a statement of collective acceptance, or perhaps something darker. But as mentioned earlier, this line has been grievously misused across history. It's not a theological license for hatred. It's a glimpse into how crowds, when stirred, will shout anything to stay on the dominant side of power. You may recall how Jesus, throughout his trial, remained largely silent. He did not respond to the crowd. He didn't shout for justice. He didn't call down angels as some taunted him to do. That silence stands in contrast to the rising chant of violence, a quiet that reveals more than any reply ever could. The decision to crucify Jesus wasn't made by one man. It wasn't even made in one moment. It was the result of layered fear, the Sanhedrin's fear of losing control, Pilate's fear of political consequence, the crowd's fear of standing alone. And so the crowd, whoever they were, became the final push in a long sequence of abdications. They didn't create the injustice. They merely confirmed it. Loudly. And once their cry was heard, history changed its course. Crucifixion wasn't just execution, it was empire in motion. A message nailed to wood. Rome didn't crucify to kill efficiently. It crucified to humiliate, to terrify, to make examples that lingered long after the body was gone. By the time Jesus was sentenced, crucifixion had already become a familiar horror across the Roman world. It was reserved for rebels, runaway slaves, and traitors, not for citizens, not for the privileged, but for those the empire wanted to erase publicly and painfully. It wasn't merely death, it was deterrence carved into skin, displayed on hilltops, written into the dust of occupied lands. That's what makes Jesus' sentence so politically loaded. The charge had been shaped, pressed, and presented not as a religious dispute, but as sedition. King of the Jews wasn't a spiritual title in this context. It was insurrectionist graffiti. And crucifixion was how Rome handled kings it didn't crown. You may recall from earlier how Pilate, though hesitant, ultimately folded to pressure from both the priests and the crowd. But his final verdict wasn't generic, it was calculated. The use of crucifixion, rather than a quicker form of death, served a very specific imperial purpose. Crucifixion wasn't done behind walls. Victims were led out in public. They carried their own crossbeam, a form of submission, humiliation, and weight. Their crime was written on a placard which would either be hung around their neck or nailed above their head. For Jesus, the sign read, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." Pilate's words etched in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. Not just a label, but a multilingual warning to every passerby. The Gospels preserve the tension. The priests begged Pilate to change the sign to say he claimed to be king. But Pilate refused. "What I have written, I have written." Was it mockery, defiance? A final twist of irony, whatever it was, the sign remained, and with it, the message. This is what happens to would-be kings in Caesar's world. There's a chilling consistency in Rome's use of crucifixion. In 71 BCE, during the revolt of Spartacus, the Romans crucified over 6,000 slaves along the Appian Way, a line of bodies stretching for miles. Flesh as political punctuation. Jesus' crucifixion fits that pattern, not in scale but in symbolism. He wasn't executed in private. He was displayed on a hill visible from the road leading into Jerusalem. The same road he had entered days earlier, cheered as a king, now watched him die like a criminal. Full circle, full control. One obscure detail: Roman crucifixion wasn't standardized. Victims might be tied or nailed. Crosses could be T-shaped, X-shaped, or the now familiar plus. The duration varied, some lasted hours, others days. But the one constant was degradation. Crucifixion stripped not just life, but dignity. Nakedness, exposure, insects, taunts. It was a slow unraveling of the person and their cause. And Jesus wasn't alone. The Gospels say 2 others were crucified with him, thieves or bandits, though the word used, lestai, more likely referred to insurrectionists. That places Jesus among rebels flanked not by petty criminals, but by men Rome saw as threats. The presence of these others adds context. It implies that the crucifixions that day were not spontaneous. They were scheduled, prepared. Jesus wasn't caught in a moment, he was placed in a row. His death wasn't isolated. It was part of a message. You'll remember from earlier how the priests feared Jesus' growing influence. Crucifixion solved that with brutal clarity. It silenced the voice without a sword. It broke the body and hung it where hope could see. But as with all oppressive tools, there was a blind spot. Rome's cruelty was effective but not subtle, and in making Jesus suffer as a rebel, they gave him the status of one. They placed him not beside priests or scribes, but beside resistance. And in doing so, they helped forge the image of a king who had threatened without weapons, who had died as one of the oppressed. Scholars debate whether Pilate meant to mock Jesus or mock the Jews who brought him. Perhaps both. Perhaps he didn't care. His signature appears in the form of that wooden placard, the infamous titulus, and then he fades into history. But the politics of crucifixion didn't fade. You may recall how earlier we discussed Pilate's need to maintain order. Crucifixion was part of that playbook. A public display of control, a denial of legitimacy, a calculated horror. And yet in this case it backfired, because this death didn't end quietly. It became a symbol, a rallying cry. The cross, once Rome's message of domination, would soon be turned upside down, claimed by those who followed the man it killed. Worn not as a threat, but as a banner. The irony is profound. Rome used crucifixion to erase movements. But in Jesus' case, it launched one. By the time the hammer rang against the nails, they were gone. The men who had walked beside him, who had broken bread with him, who had sworn they would never leave even if it meant death, had disappeared into shadows. It was not a betrayal like Judas's. It was something quieter, something slower. It was the silence of absence. And silence, as history often shows, can be louder than denial. You may recall earlier how Peter, one of the most devoted disciples, famously denied Jesus 3 times. Not before soldiers, not in court, but in the courtyard of the high priest beside a fire. A servant girl's question undid him. You were with him. I don't know him. 3 chances to speak. 3 retreats into fear. And then the rooster crowed. But Peter wasn't alone. The rest had scattered even earlier at the moment of Jesus' arrest in Gethsemane. The Gospel of Mark includes the strange and haunting detail of a young man fleeing naked, his garment torn away. It reads like a metaphor for the entire group, unprepared, exposed, and running. This absence is not a flaw in the narrative, it's central to it, because it highlights the total loneliness of Jesus' trial. He is not defended, not witnessed, not remembered in real time by those who loved him most. Their silence doesn't just hang over the trial, it shapes it. In ancient Jewish legal tradition, an accused person could benefit from character witnesses. People could stand and speak on their behalf. In Jesus' case, none do. No one says I was blind, and now I see. No one says he healed my son. No one says he fed me when I was starving. Those voices had vanished, swallowed by the risk of association. And it matters. Because silence in the face of injustice is not neutral. It gives weight to the lie. It wraps fear in collective permission. The disciples weren't cowards by nature. Many would later go on to preach, to testify, to die for what they believed. But in this moment, in this singular night of pressure and fire and empire, they faltered. One obscure but significant detail appears in Luke's Gospel. After Peter's third denial, Jesus turns and looks at him. Just that. A look. No words. No condemnation. Just an unspoken recognition of the weight of silence. And Peter, struck by it, weeps bitterly. That look says more than 1,000 sermons. Some scholars have suggested that the Gospels highlight the disciples' abandonment. To magnify Jesus' isolation, that the writers crafted this silence as a narrative foil. But if that's true, it still reflects a very human truth. Fear silences even the faithful. You'll recall from earlier how the trial unfolded, witnesses lying, priests tearing robes, Pilate equivocating. But what's absent is just as damning as what's said. No disciple interrupts. No friend protests. No follower disrupts the verdict. Jesus stands alone. This isolation becomes even more striking when viewed against the backdrop of his earlier ministry. Crowds had followed him. People had listened for hours. He had healed, fed, wept, and walked with the forgotten. And now he was the one forgotten. Except by a few. According to the Gospels, some women followed him even then, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and others unnamed. They watched, from a distance perhaps, but they stayed. While the men vanished, the women endured. Quietly, steadily. Faithful not with swords, but with presence. This reversal, men disappearing, women witnessing, is another tension the Gospel writers preserve without apology. And it reminds us that loyalty sometimes looks less like shouting and more like standing still. The silence of the disciples also speaks to the broader question of expectation. They had followed Jesus believing he was the Messiah. But their version of Messiah likely included triumph, revolution, victory. Not arrest, not humiliation, not death. And so when the trial unfolded not as a coronation, but as a condemnation, they didn't know what to do. The story had broken its expected pattern, and in that rupture they lost their words. Modern readers often wonder, why didn't they speak? Why didn't at least one of them testify? The truth may be as simple as this: they were afraid. Afraid of the crowd, afraid of Rome, afraid that the same cross waited for them. And yet their absence makes Jesus' solitude even more profound. He didn't just die for others, he died without them, until later. Because silence doesn't last forever. After the crucifixion, after the burial, the disciples reappear. Slowly, tentatively, some still doubting. Some still afraid. But something shifts, and that silence they once embraced, it turns into the noise of a movement. But in this moment, on this day, Jesus is alone. Not because he failed his friends, but because they couldn't yet carry the weight of the moment. And that perhaps is the most human detail in the entire trial. They pierced his side. They cast lots for his clothing. He was silent before his accusers. He died among criminals. And as he hung on a Roman cross, the ancient words of Hebrew prophets seemed to echo across the centuries, fragments of Isaiah, whispers of the Psalms, shadows from Zechariah. For early Christians, this wasn't coincidence. It was fulfillment. Prophecy at last had found its form. But what if prophecy wasn't simply fulfilled? What if it was framed? You may recall how earlier we explored the accusations and the trial, how the charges shifted, how the procedures bent, how silence and fear shaped the outcome. But after the verdict, after the trial itself, the story of Jesus would be told and retold. And in that retelling, something remarkable happened. The trial began to mirror Scripture with increasing clarity. The Gospel writers weren't historians in the modern sense. They were theologians, evangelists, witnesses to faith. And they wrote not to record bare facts, but to reveal meaning. Their audience, mostly Jewish and Greek converts, knew the scriptures well. So when they read of Jesus being oppressed and afflicted, yet opening not his mouth, they would recall Isaiah 53. When they read of his hands and feet being pierced, they would think of Psalm 22. And when they saw that he was numbered among transgressors, it matched exactly what Isaiah had written centuries earlier. So the question rises, were these events predicted, or were the predictions used to shape the events? It's an uncomfortable question for some, but it doesn't diminish the power of the narrative. In fact, it deepens it. Because the gospel writers were doing something incredibly sophisticated, they were placing Jesus into a vast and ancient tapestry. They were saying not just with theology, but with literary technique that this story was not new. It was the culmination. Take, for example, the moment when Jesus refuses to answer his accusers. That silence is striking. It fulfills Isaiah's image of the suffering servant like a lamb led to the slaughter. But it also serves a narrative purpose. It isolates him, sets him apart, elevates his death beyond mere injustice. The silence isn't just stoic, it's prophetic. Or consider the casting of lots for his garments. This detail appears in Psalm 22, "They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment." The Gospel of John explicitly cites this moment as a fulfillment, but it also functions as connective tissue linking the chaos of the crucifixion to a larger divine script. And yet some scholars argue that these fulfillments may have been theological constructions. That is, the gospel writers may have shaped or selected details from Jesus' trial and death to align with Scripture, not to deceive, but to reveal meaning in a way their audiences would understand. This doesn't mean the events didn't happen, but it suggests that how they were remembered was influenced by sacred memory. There's also the matter of chronology. The Gospels were written decades after Jesus' death, Mark likely first around 65-70 CE, followed by Matthew, Luke, and then John. In that span of time, oral traditions evolved, were clarified, and often interpreted through the lens of Hebrew Scripture. The Passion narrative wasn't static, it was layered. You'll recall from earlier how Pilate hesitated, how Herod mocked, how the crowd chose Barabbas. Each of those moments can be read as political history. But they also mirror older stories, Egypt's hardness of heart, the scapegoat rituals of Leviticus, the rejection of prophets by their own people. This technique, known as midrash, was common in Jewish storytelling. It didn't aim to fabricate, but to interpret, to draw spiritual truth from historical events. And in the Passion narrative, the Gospel writers employed it masterfully. Of course, some critics point to these alignments and suggest fabrication, that the trial was retrofitted to match prophecy. But even if elements were shaped, that doesn't mean they were false. It means they were remembered with meaning in mind. And meaning in sacred storytelling often outweighs minutiae. One open question continues to stir scholarly debate: did Jesus himself believe he was fulfilling prophecy? Or did his followers later see his death through that lens? Some suggest he consciously acted out elements of Scripture, riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, quoting Psalm 22 on the cross. Others believe these details were added later to connect the dots. There's no definitive answer, just threads. You may remember how earlier we spoke of silence of Jesus, not defending himself, not pleading, not resisting. That silence, too, aligns with prophecy. And so we're left to wonder, was he choosing that path because he knew what the Scriptures said? Or was the silence later interpreted through the prism of ancient words, perhaps both? Because prophecy isn't just prediction, it's pattern. And Jesus' trial followed patterns laid long before patterns of innocence condemned, of righteous suffering, of truth crushed under fear. So whether the events were shaped to match prophecy or prophecy was fulfilled in the events, the effect is the same. The trial becomes more than injustice. It becomes revelation. A verdict, yes, but also a vision. The trial was over, the verdict sealed. But somewhere, perhaps beneath the temple, perhaps buried in a bureaucrat's scroll case, there may have once existed something that never made it into scripture, never echoed from pulpits or pulpits' airs. Not a gospel, not a prophecy, but minutes, transcripts, a record of what was said that night by the elders, the priests, and the men who signed the death of a carpenter from Nazareth. The secret records of the Sanhedrin. It sounds like fiction, and perhaps it is. There is no surviving document that officially logs the proceedings of Jesus' trial. But the Sanhedrin, as a governing religious body, was no stranger to paperwork. Court decisions, ritual regulations, temple protocols, these things were preserved in writing. Some were even entered into the proto-rabbinical texts that would become the Mishnah. So is it possible that such records once existed? A scroll with the names of the judges present, the charges filed. The testimonies that didn't quite agree, some historians believe it's likely. The Sanhedrin was meticulous, even if fragmented. And Jesus' trial, despite its irregularity, was not a spontaneous affair. It involved multiple leaders, cross-jurisdictional coordination, and a case they knew would cause ripples. Someone somewhere would have recorded something, even if just for internal justification. A line in a ledger, Yeshua ben Yosef convicted of blasphemy, referred to Roman prefect for sentence execution. But if such records did exist, they've vanished. Burned in the sack of Jerusalem in 70 CE, lost in the revolts that scattered the priests, buried in the archival silence of history, or less dramatically, deliberately erased. You may remember from earlier how the charges against Jesus evolved blasphemy before the Sanhedrin, sedition before Pilate. The inconsistency itself raises suspicion. And some have speculated that any written record of the initial hearing would have revealed these contradictions too plainly. That it didn't serve the temple's long-term image to preserve a document showing such a shaky legal foundation. An obscure tradition in early rabbinic commentary hints at the memory of false messiahs being tried and condemned in prior generations. The texts rarely name Jesus, but the echoes are there, vague references to a certain man who led Israel astray or practiced sorcery. It's all very thin, all very careful, as if the name could still burn parchment. This caution, this silence may have been intentional. After all, by the time the Gospels were being copied and distributed across the empire, Jesus' followers were growing in number. The very existence of Christianity posed a threat to temple authority, first ideologically, then politically. Why preserve a document that could give the other side ammunition? It's also worth remembering that the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE was a cataclysm. Not just a building lost, but an entire administrative infrastructure obliterated. Scrolls, records, logs gone, carried off by flame and sword. The Roman siege didn't just kill people, it erased systems. And yet the idea of a missing trial record has fascinated writers and theologians for centuries. It appears in apocryphal works, speculative fiction, and conspiracy theories. A parchment in a vault, a sealed archive beneath Vatican stones, a whispered line in a Dead Sea Scroll, none verified, all tantalizing. You'll recall how earlier we discussed the inconsistencies in the trial, the false witnesses, the private setting, the illegal timing. A written record might have exposed those flaws. Or perhaps it would have defended the Sanhedrin's case. We'll never know, because whatever paper trail may have once existed has gone dark. And this darkness itself tells a story. Because history isn't just shaped by what's remembered. It's shaped by what's missing. The gaps, the silences, the rooms that echo too cleanly. In the case of Jesus, the silence of the Sanhedrin's records only fuels the sense that his trial wasn't merely rushed, it was buried. Not just a legal miscarriage, but an archival one. A verdict carved into flesh, but not into scroll. They tell the same story, or so it seems. 4 books, 4 witnesses, 4 voices describing the final hours of Jesus' life. Yet when you place them side by side, something curious begins to emerge. The trial shifts. The players move. Words change. Silence thickens in one version and unravels in another. And the deeper you look, the more you realize the Gospels agree in outline, but they whisper different truths between the lines. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Together they form the Passion narrative that has shaped centuries of theology, art, liturgy, and belief. But each Gospel has its own rhythm, its own emphasis, its own theological aim. And nowhere is this more evident than in the way they portray the trial of Jesus. You may recall from earlier how Jesus was passed between courts, Sanhedrin, Pilate, Herod. That path exists in all 4 Gospels, but the details differ. Mark believed to be the earliest presents Jesus as almost entirely silent before his accusers. There's a starkness to Mark's version, a sense of abandonment and haste. Jesus speaks only when directly asked if he is the Messiah, and even then his reply is veiled in mystery. Matthew builds on Mark, but adds nuance. He includes Pilate's wife's dream, the washing of hands, and the crowd's chilling line, "His blood be on us and on our children." These are absent from the earlier text. The narrative becomes more dramatic, the tension heightened. Matthew's audience, likely Jewish Christians, would have understood the weight of these additions. Luke, on the other hand, softens Pilate's image. In Luke's version, Pilate repeatedly insists on Jesus' innocence. He even declares it 3 times. And Luke alone includes the scene of Jesus being sent to Herod Antipas, a political detour that shifts some responsibility away from the Roman governor. Luke's Jesus is calm, composed, and compassionate. He speaks to the women of Jerusalem, forgives his executioners, and comforts the thief beside him. And then there's John. John rewrites the courtroom entirely. His Jesus is regal, commanding, and cryptic. He engages in deep philosophical conversation with Pilate, discussing truth, kingship, and power. "My kingdom is not of this world," he says. There is no agony in the garden in John's account, no trial before the Sanhedrin, at least not in the same form. Everything is elevated, almost cosmic. The cross isn't a defeat, it's a coronation. So what do we make of these differences? Some point to them as contradictions. Others see them as the natural outcome of oral tradition, stories passed down, reshaped by memory, community, and intent. The discrepancies aren't errors. They're windows into how each gospel writer understood the meaning of the trial. One obscure but telling variation, the timing of Jesus' final meal. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Last Supper is a Passover meal. But in John, Jesus is crucified before the feast begins, at the very hour when the lambs are being slaughtered in the temple. The symbolism is unmistakable. In John's telling, Jesus is the Lamb. These differences extend to who strikes Jesus, where the trial is held, the sequence of events, and even the phrasing of key lines. Was Jesus silent before Pilate, or did he speak at length? Was he tried by the full Sanhedrin or a smaller group? Did the crowd shout for Barabbas in all 4 accounts, or is the crowd more ambiguous? In some scholars continue to debate these details. Some argue for harmonization, blending the accounts into one cohesive timeline. Others accept the variations as part of a larger truth, that the Gospels are not newspaper articles, but theological portraits. You'll remember from earlier how prophecy and storytelling interwove throughout the Passion. Here, too, the variations serve not to distort, but to reveal. Each writer paints Jesus against a different backdrop. To Matthew, he is the fulfillment of Jewish prophecy. To Mark, he is the suffering servant. To Luke, the innocent man unjustly condemned. To John, the incarnate Word submitting to death by his own divine timing. These portraits don't compete. They converge like four lanterns illuminating the same figure from different angles. Still, the variations challenge us. They force us to ask what matters most, the chronology of the trial or its meaning, the precision of each step or the shape of the path. And perhaps the greatest lesson in the differences is this: even in the earliest records, the story of Jesus' trial was never static. It was alive, retold, reinterpreted, reimagined by those who believed the world had changed because of it. A single trial, 4 accounts, countless echoes. He enters the gospel story as a Roman bureaucrat, stiff in a robe, washing his hands of guilt. But Pontius Pilate didn't vanish after the crucifixion. He was real, a man of flesh and flaw, whose shadow lingers not just in Scripture, but in history. If the trial of Jesus was the crossroads of empire and prophecy, then Pilate stood squarely at the center, reluctant gavel in hand. The Gospels give us a conflicted figure, a man who finds no fault in Jesus yet allows his execution, one who speaks of truth with veiled sarcasm, yet listens more to the roar of the crowd than the voice of conscience. But outside the Bible in the scrolls and stonework of antiquity, another Pilate emerges. The most well-known extra-biblical reference comes from the Jewish historian Josephus. Writing in the late 1st century, Josephus describes Pilate as a man of hard disposition, harsh, stubborn, and prone to provocation. In Antiquities of the Jews, he recounts how Pilate brought Roman military standards into Jerusalem, bearing images of the emperor. It was an open insult to Jewish law which forbade graven images. The people protested, even lay on the ground for days in nonviolent resistance. Pilate surprisingly backed down, but not out of kindness, out of political calculation. Another incident involves Pilate using temple funds to build an aqueduct. When protests broke out, he ordered his soldiers to blend into the crowd, dressed in civilian clothes, and at his signal they attacked. The result was blood on the streets. Not a peacemaker, not a philosopher. A governor with a sword in one hand and a short fuse in the other. You may recall from earlier how Pilate in the Gospels appears reluctant to crucify Jesus, offering the crowd Barabbas, deferring to Herod, washing his hands. Some scholars argue that this portrayal was shaped by the early Christians' desire to shift blame away from Rome and toward the Jewish leadership, especially in the wake of increasing Roman persecution. In this view, Pilate's hesitations were less historical fact and more narrative strategy. And yet archaeology adds a curious layer of confirmation to his existence. In 1961, a limestone block was discovered in Caesarea Maritima, once the Roman administrative capital of Judea. The stone bore a Latin inscription, Pontius Pilate, Prefect of Judea. It was the first physical evidence of the man whose name had echoed in liturgies for nearly 2,000 years. The title prefect is significant. Pilate wasn't a governor in the grand Roman sense. He was a military administrator tasked with keeping order in a tense province. Judea was politically volatile and religiously complicated. Pilate's job was not to understand it, but to suppress it efficiently, decisively, and when necessary, violently. And yet the crucifixion of Jesus suggests a moment when this calculated enforcer hesitated. Why some argue it was fear of a riot, fear of a report back to Rome, fear of losing control. You'll remember from earlier how the priests warned him, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar." That phrase alone could have sealed the verdict. Others suggest Pilate saw Jesus as a harmless mystic, not worth the blood. Still others believe Pilate enjoyed the power play, taunting the priests with the title on the cross, pretending to wash guilt away, performing Roman superiority, even as he capitulated to local demands. One obscure account comes from the early Christian author Tertullian, who claimed that Pilate became sympathetic to Christianity after Jesus' death. It's apocryphal, almost certainly fictional, but it points to the curious afterlife of Pilate's image villain, to some reluctant instrument to others even convert in the hands of pious legend. Later church traditions tried to reckon with him. The Ethiopian church remarkably even canonized him. But most Christian traditions hold his name in infamy. "Suffered under Pontius Pilate" is a line recited weekly by millions, his name immortalized, not for glory, but for failure. And perhaps that's the real tragedy of Pilate. He was not a Herod or a Caesar, not a high priest or a revolutionary, just a man trying to hold power in a boiling province. And in a single morning, pressed by voices unsure of truth, unwilling to resist, he made a decision that would define him forever. You'll recall how Pilate asked Jesus, "What is truth?" before turning away. He didn't wait for an answer, and history in turn has not waited to answer him. By the end, everyone claimed innocence. The priests said they had no choice. Pilate said he washed his hands. The crowd said the blood could fall where it may. And yet Jesus died. Not in a synagogue, not by stoning, but nailed to wood under a Roman sky, because behind the robes and the rituals, the whispers and the witnesses, there was something colder, quieter, and far more efficient, the invisible hand of empire. You may recall how earlier we traced the legal tangle of Jesus' trial, how jurisdiction passed like a hot coal between the Sanhedrin, Pilate, and Herod. But despite this dance of authority, the final blow came from one place: Rome. Not just Pilate. Rome as system. Rome as philosophy. Rome as a machine designed to keep peace through public pain. The crucifixion of Jesus was not an accident. It was an expression of Roman strategy. A visible reminder to the people of Judea and anyone else watching that kings who rise without Caesar's permission fall without mercy. This wasn't the first time Rome had faced a Messiah problem. The first century was riddled with messianic claimants. Men who gathered followers, promised liberation, quoted Isaiah, and ended up in chains or on crosses. Rome didn't need to believe these men were gods or prophets. It only needed to believe they might disrupt stability. And Jesus, despite his lack of weapons, fit that threat profile. One of the most chilling truths about Roman administration was how easily it crushed things it didn't understand. If a prophet stirred hope, Rome saw sedition. If a crowd gathered to hear a sermon, Rome imagined a riot. If a man rode into Jerusalem on a donkey welcomed like a king, Rome calculated how quickly to make an example of him. And Rome excelled at examples. An obscure but telling point, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, wasn't truly peace. It was suppression. It was the absence of open revolt achieved through the constant presence of fear. Crucifixion, public beatings, taxes enforced by threat of violence. This was how the empire maintained control. And so when the Sanhedrin presented Jesus to Pilate, Rome didn't see theology. It saw politics. An unauthorized figure claiming spiritual kingship, amassing public support. During the year's most volatile festival, that wasn't a case for debate. That was a threat assessment. You'll remember from earlier that Pilate's reluctance wasn't about compassion. It was about calculation. He didn't find Jesus dangerous, but he understood that not acting might make others think he was soft. And in Roman politics, perception was policy. This invisible hand extended beyond Judea. Across the empire, provincial governors were under constant pressure to report stability. Revolts, even minor ones, could bring career-ending scrutiny. Pilate had already made mistakes. One more would cost him more than his post. So even if Jesus posed no true threat, the idea of Jesus was enough. The phrase "King of the Jews" was the lever. Not because Jesus used it, but because Rome needed that label to justify his execution. Without it, there was no legal cause. With it, they could say, "We killed a rebel, not a rabbi." This framing echoes through the Gospels. You may recall how Pilate resisted changing the sign on the cross. "What I have written," he said. The charge remained king. And that word, so weighted, so political, became the justification Rome could point to if anyone asked. And so Rome's hand, while rarely named in detail, is everywhere in this story. In the legal maneuvers, in the soldier's boots, in the cross itself, which was not a Jewish method of execution. It was a Roman invention designed for spectacle, for deterrence, for dehumanization. And in this case, it worked on the surface. Jesus died. The movement should have died with him. His disciples scattered. The crowd dispersed. Jerusalem returned to its rhythms. But the paradox of empire is this: its power is visible, immediate, and short-sighted. It sees the crowd, not the echo. It crushes the man, but cannot erase the memory. What Rome couldn't calculate was the narrative that would follow. That a cross would become a symbol not of terror, but of hope. That the trial it manipulated would become the cornerstone of a faith that spread far beyond Caesar's reach. One open question historians still wrestle with: was Rome's involvement entirely reactive, or was it proactive? Did Pilate see an opportunity to suppress a movement before it grew? Or was he simply a cog following protocol, minimizing unrest? The truth is likely both. Rome didn't need to understand Jesus' teachings. It only needed to see that people were listening. And in Rome's world, unregulated influence was indistinguishable from insurgency. And so Jesus died not just under Pilate, but under policy. You may recall how we've walked through each stage of this trial: the false witnesses, the fear of the priests, the crowd's cry, the silence of the disciples. And now behind it all, we see the steady presence of empire. Not loud, not theological, just inevitable. The invisible hand of Rome didn't strike with rage. It struck with indifference. And perhaps that is its most enduring judgment. The gavel fell, but it didn't echo. There was no courtroom in the modern sense. No defense lawyer, no jury. Only whispers, robes, shadows, and one man who stood silent through it all. And now, at the edge of every question you're left to ask: was Jesus truly condemned for what he believed, or for what others feared? Let's step back. You've followed the path. From the tension in Roman-occupied Jerusalem, through the political maneuvers of the priests, to the stifled conscience of Pilate and the roar of the manipulated crowd. You've seen how prophecy tangled with politics, how testimony blurred with rumor, and how justice gave way to expedience. So what truly was the verdict? The official charge read, "King of the Jews," not blasphemer, not false teacher, but king. It was a Roman label, a political accusation, one that transformed a Galilean preacher into a threat to imperial order. And yet Jesus never once claimed a throne, raised a sword, or plotted a rebellion in the way Rome would recognize. His was a kingdom not of this world. But the world didn't care, and the Sanhedrin, their charge was blasphemy. But the trial they held at night in haste without full quorum or due procedure raises more questions than answers. The scrolls of the Mishnah suggest that trials for capital offenses were not to be held at night, nor concluded in one day, nor based on contradictory witnesses. Yet that's exactly what happened. So was this trial truly legal? Or was it a performance rushed to secure a verdict before the sun rose and the crowd awoke? Then there's Pilate. You may recall how he declared, "I find no fault in this man." Not once, but multiple times. And yet he handed him over anyway. Was it cowardice, pragmatism, or simply the cost of doing business in Judea? He offered Jesus to Herod, then to the crowd, then washed his hands of it all. A gesture that looked pious, but may have been pure theater. One obscure but telling detail, some ancient sources suggest Pilate's political position was already under strain. Letters of complaint about his earlier brutality may have reached Rome. If he let a supposed rebel walk and a riot followed his career, maybe even his life was at risk. Jesus, in that light, became a scapegoat for imperial anxiety. Now consider the crowd. Were they truly the same people who waved palm branches days earlier, or a different group hand-picked, coerced, inflamed by temple leaders whispering behind them? We may never know. But what's clear is that voices can be swayed. Silence can be louder than speech. And absence like that of the disciples can shape a verdict as powerfully as presence. The narrative threads converge here not on the hill of Golgotha, but in the space just before the final breath of deliberation, the last chance for mercy. And each player stepped back. The priests clung to order. Pilate clung to power. The crowd clung to fury. And Jesus stood alone. So was this a failure of law or a success of empire? Was it a planned execution, or a verdict already written by the forces of control, fear, and political maintenance? It's tempting to see the trial as a tragic error. But what if it wasn't an error at all? What if it was the inevitable outcome of a world in which truth was inconvenient, peace was enforced, and leaders made decisions not by conviction but by calculation? Even the Gospels, which differ in many details, seem to agree on this point. No one truly owned the verdict. Each passed it along. Each claimed their hands were clean. And yet, the cross was raised, the sentence carried out, and history was changed not just by the death of a man, but by the moral questions his trial left behind. One final open question remains: was the trial of Jesus a singular event or a mirror? Has it echoed in every era where power fears truth, where legality masks injustice, where the innocent are punished because they threaten the comfortable? That question, perhaps, is the one still waiting for a verdict. It did not end at the cross. The shouts quieted, the sky darkened, and the earth stilled. And yet the verdict echoed across empires, churches, manuscripts, and minds. What began as a local trial wrapped in robes and Roman policy became a moment that reshaped history. You've walked beside the shadows, past the priests and governors, the betrayals and silences, the twisting legalities and unspoken fears. You've seen how each figure stepped into the drama, some with trembling hands, others with calculated hearts. And together, they built a verdict. One that may not have been just, but was terrifyingly effective. But time, as always, is a patient editor. Generations later, that verdict continues to raise questions. Scholars revisit it. Artists reinterpret it. Preachers proclaim it. Scribes translated and retranslated its details until each word held both fact and faith. And in the stillness of libraries, courts, and cathedrals, people continue to ask, was it justice or sacrifice, martyrdom or mistake? The trial of Jesus lingers because it was never simply about law. It was about fear, about control, about what happens when truth stands calmly before power and power flinches. That image, Jesus silent before the storm, has become more than a page in Scripture. It has become a mirror, and every era in its own way has looked into it. Perhaps that's why this story never fully ends. Now let the light dim softly. Let the voices grow distant. Let the questions for now settle like dust on old parchment. You've heard the secret histories. You've felt the weight of choices made in candlelit corridors. And now, as the final echo fades, close your eyes. Breathe. Some truths whisper louder than any verdict.